Okay, so now we're going to talk about market governance and pricing. Okay, I've been emphasizing throughout this lecture that capitalism, it's an ongoing search for order because it is an economic system based upon competition. Okay, it essentially is what John Dewey said. John Dewey was an institutionalist. Incidentally, he created the Dewey Decimal System. Go figure. So many of us don't like him because of that, but he was also a very good economist and social thinker. John Dewey said that capitalism is the ongoing search for order. Okay? It's sort of a trade-off, if you will, or an antagonistic relationship where you have the economic system, capitalism, which encourages competition. It's businesses competing against one another for market share, versus all these businesses that want to try to eliminate competition. Okay? They don't want competition. They want to survive. Okay? So, what you can see is that capitalism turns into an ongoing search for stability, right? Firms have one goal, right? They want profits, but more importantly, what they want is to reproduce one another, or reproduce themselves, not one another. They want to reproduce themselves. They want to make sure that they will live to see another day. What do we mean by that? They want to stay in business, okay? In fact, right, neoclassical economics always emphasizes maximizing your profits. Well, when the economy gets bad, firms aren't thinking about maximizing their profits. What they're trying to do is stay in business. Okay? How do you stay in business? You acquire market share, right? You need market power. You get market share, that gives you power, which makes sure you will reproduce yourself, right? You'll reproduce your business. You'll live to see another day, okay? So, it's a quest for certainty. Firms want control over their environment, okay? Why do they want control over their environment? It ensures their long-term survival, okay? Firms want to survive. They don't want to go out of business. They want to stay in business. They want to survive. So what they do is, how do you get to survive? They need to come up with ways to focus on long-term growth. Okay? Firms focus on strategies to grow themselves over the long term. So how do they do that? They come up with strategies, what we call transaction reproducing prices. We'll get to that. And the business remains a going concern. Okay? Going concern meaning that you constantly have to worry about how to stay in business and to acquire market share in order to reproduce yourself. It's a going concern. You're always concerned with it. It's ongoing. Okay? So, what this leads us to in heterodox microeconomics is that capitalism turns into a search for stability, and that search for stability produces something that we call market governance. Okay? Now, when people hear the term market governance most of the time, they think that it means the government coming in and regulating things, okay? That's not what market governance is. Government could be one form of market governance, but what market governance really is direct or indirect ways, okay, of providing regulations to the market. Now, it doesn't have to be government regulations. Firms can get together and come up with ways of regulating or governing the market, okay? In other words, they come up with their own ways of providing stability. So in a way, it's actually firms trying to decrease competition so in order to guarantee that they will survive, okay? And the easiest way to think about this is Coke and Pepsi, right? If Coke wanted to, they could most likely wipe out Pepsi within a year. Okay, Coca-Cola is much bigger than Pepsi. They have cheaper costs. they have a better brand name, more people drink Coca-Cola than Pepsi. So why doesn't Coke just try to wipe out Pepsi? Well, in order to do that, they would have to engage in maybe a price war or other things like that. And anytime you engage in a war or some sort of competition, you're not absolutely sure that you will win. Okay? Coca-Cola would much rather sit back, allow Pepsi to exist, and know that they will continue to reproduce themselves rather than engage in some sort of a business competition with Pepsi, which Coca-Cola might lose. And if Coca-Cola loses, that means that Coca-Cola would go out of business. Okay? Coca-Cola obviously doesn't want that, so they're more content to let Pepsi exist, know that they will continue to sell Coca-Cola, and then compete with Pepsi on what you call a non-price basis, meaning just through advertising and things like that. Coca-Cola advertises as, right, it's Coca-Cola. Everybody loves, it's always Coca-Cola, right? You guys have this ingrained into your heads that Coca-Cola gives you a warm, fuzzy feeling, even though the product itself is absolutely horrible for your biology and your health, right? Nothing actually good comes from drinking Coca-Cola. But what you do is allow Coke and Pepsi to exist, and it gets advertised as Coca-Cola, something indispensable for your life. You need to have Coke, right, in your lifetime in order to have fun. And instead of trying to put Pepsi out of business directly by lowering their prices, things like that, instead they try to beat Pepsi through marketing, okay? To make people think Coca-Cola is such a great product that you should choose us over Pepsi, which gives Coca-Cola more market share. More market share, more power. More power, you increase the likelihood that you will continue to exist, meaning you don't go out of business, okay? So, what we find out is that this concept of market governance, okay, it's ways in which companies attempt to govern the markets in which they exist. In order to do so, they use plans. They come up with plans on how they're going to govern the markets, which means all economies are planned economies, okay? Anytime you're taking resources today to produce something tomorrow, anytime you're taking carbonated water and high fructose corn syrup today to make Coca-Cola tomorrow, that means you now have a planned economy. If you have a planned economy, if you accept that this is a planned economy where corporations are coming up with plans on how they're going to produce things, then you see that capitalism is actually a planned economy. It's no different from socialism in that regard. Socialism is a planned economy. Capitalism is a planned economy. The difference is that in capitalism, corporations and companies are doing the planning, whereas in socialism, the government does the planning. But it's indisputable that both are planned economies. Anytime you're taking resources today to produce something tomorrow, you have a planned economy. Market governance is what allows you to realize that. Market governance demonstrates that all economies are in fact planned economies. So, there's the three main forms of market governance. There's price leadership, there's cartels, and then there's the government, okay? What's price leadership? There's two different main price leadership things, which we don't really have to get into. Price leadership is simply Coca-Cola, the biggest soft drink producer in the country. They set their price at $1.25. Done. Pepsi knows that Coca-Cola has a better cost structure than they do. Coca-Cola has lower costs than Pepsi. So, what does Pepsi do? They don't want to spark a price war with Pepsi. So what they do is, they set their price at $1.25 as well. Coca-Cola is the leader in prices, right? They are the price leadership. Whatever Coke sets their prices at, everyone else sets their prices at the same exact level. If Coke raises it to $1.50, everyone else follows suit. Why? Because they don't want to compete with Coca-Cola, because they will most likely lose. Okay? Another way of governing the market is through trade associations. Okay? Trade associations, basically, if you've ever seen a magazine at your job lying around, let's say you're an architect, right? And it's called Architects Quarterly or Architectural Digest. What that is it discusses companies and what they are doing, right? Therefore, by subscribing to Architectural Digest, you find out what your competitors' business practices are. So if you want to compete against them, you can, or if you want to make the market stable, you simply do whatever the biggest architecture firm is doing. That way, the market is stable and there's not a huge element of competition going on, okay? So trade associations, publications, things like that. If you think of different professions, many of them have trade associations that are not run by the government, they're actually run by 3 or 4 of the biggest companies in that industry. Those groups get together, figure out through the trade organization how that industry is going to be run, and then all the other companies follow suit. Okay? What that is that's a process of eliminating competition and bringing stability to the market, right? They're governing the market. Okay? So, finally, government, if private firms cannot work together, frequently they go to the government and ask them, hey, can you tell us a solution to this competition? And we all agree to abide by whatever the government comes up with as its solution, okay? What that does is it restricts competition to stabilize prices. And importantly, what market governance allows us to see, whether it's the government or if it's just simply firms through price leadership or trade associations, things like that. What you come to realize is that all industries, every single sector of the economy has market governance, okay? If every single sector, industry, area, whatever you want to call it, has market governance going on, then there is absolutely no such thing as the free market, okay? As Americans, we all love to talk about the free market, how great it is, and how much we need the free market. And the free market allows us to grow, blah, blah, blah. Anytime you're taking resources today for production tomorrow, you have a planned economy. If you have a planned economy through market governance, there is no such thing as a free market. The market is planned. It's not free, it's planned, okay? So this whole idea as Americans, where we walk around and say, the free market's great. There is no such thing as the free market. It never existed. The markets have always been planned, and it's not by the government. Companies are doing planning in markets. Companies themselves are what have eliminated the free market. Now, I'm not saying the elimination of the free market is bad, okay? This is what companies do in order to make capitalism stable. If we didn't have market governance, there would be a huge amount of uncertainty. Imagine if everyone was a price taker, right? If Coca-Cola was a price taker, They have no idea what they should set their prices at. So Coca-Cola may produce a lot one day, nothing the next day, a lot the next day, right? You would have this herky-jerky production going on. Coca-Cola is an enormous company that needs to plan out how many cans of soda it's going to produce years in advance, okay? If they couldn't plan out how many cans of soda they were going to produce 3 years from now, because of the free market and they were a price taker, Coca-Cola would not make anything, right? If they were a price taker and the free market actually existed, Coca-Cola would have so much uncertainty about what they were doing, it would make more sense to never produce soda, okay? Which might be good for us biologically, but health-wise, but a lot of us would probably be disappointed, okay? Now, it's one thing if Coca-Cola, that'd probably be good if Coca-Cola stopped producing, but what about these things, right? Samsung needs to figure out how many phones they're going to sell 3 years from now. So they need to be able to plan. If they weren't able to plan because competition was free in the free market, they would have no idea what they were going to do. Which means Samsung would probably not exist. No one would want to start this up because you'd have no idea what's going to happen. Okay? So, what I'm trying to get at is market governance isn't bad. What it does is it brings stability to capitalism. And what it also does is market governance shows there's no such thing as the free market. Free market has never existed, never will. Okay? Companies make sure it doesn't. Okay? So a lot of the time in the news you hear about the government's ruining the free market or the government is impeding on the free market. Two things. One, it's actually companies that are impeding on the free market. And two, the free market never existed. It's not like there's a war between the free market and government. This never existed. It's companies trying to figure out how to stabilize the market, how to stabilize capitalism. That's what companies do. Through price leadership, trade associations, pamphlets, things like that. Just extracurricular activities that certain members of each company belong to. It could even be sometimes certain companies belong to what you would call like old men beer league softball, right? Or even golf leagues, where it's, you know, the Smith Barney golf team up against the JP Morgan golf team. Well, when they're on the golf course, some of those people are talking about business, right? They're figuring out, this is what we're doing, this is what you guys are doing, okay, and then they start doing the same thing, okay? That is another form of market governance, and it has nothing to do with the government impeding on the free market, right? It doesn't. It's simply companies within the market trying to eliminate competition, okay? So, what does our conception of competition become? Neoclassicals define competition through firm size, right? It's either perfect competition, everyone is small, or it's monopoly, and there's one firm that's really big, okay? That's not adequate for a concept of competition. Competition is actually a process to keep your market share, okay? It's a process, or capitalism becomes a process of decreasing competition to keep your market share, okay? That's what competition actually is in capitalism. Competition becomes firms attempting to gain as much market share as they can while stabilizing the actual markets in which they exist, okay? How do you do that? There's usually a single market price, right? How much is it for a smartphone? Whether it's an iPhone or an Android, they're both about $500. How much is it for a really nice pair of shoes? Whether they're Reeboks or Nikes or Adidas or whatever, they're about $100, $80 to $100. How much is it for a bottle of water, whether it's Poland Spring, Dasani, Evian, whomever. It's about $1.50. How much is it for soda? It's about $1.25 for a can of Coke or $1.50 for a 20-ounce bottle, right? So what it is what we see is competition ends up producing a single market price, even though all these companies have different cost structures, right? Coca-Cola's cost structure is much different from RC Cola, right, or CVS Cola. Completely different cost structures, but they still sell their soda, their product, for the same price. Why? Because they want to restrict competition so they survive. So what do we find out? Well, a market is certainly not, and this is the neoclassicals for part F, where it says market is not. A market is not a price-making mechanism for allocating scarce resources, right? In economics, in neoclassical economics, this is supposedly the market, and you have a supply curve and a demand curve. And where they intersect, that's the price. So the market is what makes the price, supposedly. Okay? It turns out that's not what the market is. The market doesn't set prices. Companies set prices. Okay? Secondly, the market is not inherently efficient in allocation. It doesn't allocate scarce resources effectively. There are no scarce resources. That's the whole point of a surplus. We produce more than we need, so therefore there's something left over. A surplus inherently means not scarce. Okay? So markets are not scarce allocation mechanisms. The same way neoclassical economics defines economics as the allocation of scarce resources amongst competing ends. Well, market governance shows that that's completely erroneous, right? It makes no sense if you just start thinking about market governance. Third, they're not homogeneous in products or cost structures, okay? Producers have different cost structures and they make different things, okay? An Android is different from an iPhone. Coca-Cola, different from Pepsi. It's not like the neoclassicals where they just say one standardized product, right? It's not corn or a blacksmith and horseshoes, right? It's not that simple. There's more than just shoes. There's Adidas, Nike, right? Different types of shoes. So what is a market? A market is a place of exchange. It's where sellers and buyers come together and exchange goods and services for money. It's a place where a buyer's access to seller's goods are limited based on price, right? If we wanted to, everyone could have an iPhone or an app or an Android, right? Everyone could. We could just produce them and give them away. But the fact that we sell them in markets limits people's ability to buy them, right? The fact that this goes for $500 means that some people in, some lower income people are not able to afford it, okay? The fact that a Maserati is priced at $80,000 means that not everyone can get one, so it becomes sort of a social symbol. You have a Maserati, you must be rich, okay? So, and being rich is good, so therefore, if you have a Maserati, it's good. Why? Because the market is what has limited buyers' access to the seller's goods and services. They do it based on price. It means that a market is socially structured, okay? The market's socially structured, meaning decisions that humans make is what determines the market. There's no law of supply, law of demand, universal theory, right? neoclassical economics tells you there are laws, the law of diminishing returns, the marginal product, right? These universal theories. It turns out that all you need is market governance to show it's not a universal theory. Turns out different markets are structured in different ways based upon social interaction. Okay? If it's socially structured, then it means it's culturally based. Okay? Markets in New Jersey work much differently than markets in Alabama. Different cultures. Okay? Markets in the United States work differently than markets in Paraguay. Okay? Socially structured. They're culturally structured. Okay? So what market governance brings us to is this idea of a conception of control. And this is all the Fligstein stuff. His name is Neil Fligstein. He works at University of California, Berkeley. He's a economic sociologist who works with market governance a lot. Okay? He came up with this idea called the conception of control, which is basically the dominant beliefs and habits that are shared by market participants over how the industry should run. Okay? So you have an incumbent, right? Coca-Cola, when it comes to software, Coca-Cola is the incumbent. They are the dominant power, and they convey to the other soda companies how the industry should be run. Okay? In other words, we want it to be stable, set it at this one price, and that's that. Okay? And then we'll just all compete through advertising. Okay? Well, that's a conception of control. The conception of control is that we're going to have one price, compete through advertising, and we're going to be stable. We're all going to have about the same market share. Or we're all going to have relatively constant market shares over time, right? Coca-Cola will be bigger than Pepsi, but they're going to have about the same share they've always had through time, unless they're successful at advertising. Okay? So that's what incumbents do. Incumbents usually set the rules of the game. Okay? Now there can be challengers. Challengers are typically new companies that want to challenge the way things have been done in the past. Okay? Silicon Valley would be a great example of incumbents versus challengers. The incumbents before Silicon Valley were IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Microsoft. Okay, they wanted the software and computer markets run in a certain way, and they were basically going to compete over computing power. Right? Then Steve Jobs and Google radically changed how computing was done in this country, right? Bill Gates decided to create the Apple operating system, and he put that in his own computers. He put them in Macintoshes. So what you had now was one company that made an operating system and the computer. So no longer did you have to get Windows and stick it in your IBM. Right? You didn't have to pair that up. Instead, Apple did it all on their own. Well, that changed the way software and computers and electronic technology was handled in this country. Okay? The same thing was once Steve Jobs figured out, why stop at computers? Maybe I should come up with the iPad and the iPod, and maybe I should start making telephones with my Apple invention in them. Okay? Once he did that, he radically shook up the cell phone market. Tablets, which didn't exist, he created the market. The iPod, he basically put Walkmans and CD players out of business. Right? He radically altered all of those markets. So Steve Jobs changed the way IBM, Microsoft, in terms of computers, the iPod changed the way Sony and who else make Panasonic made Walkmans and CD players. Tablets, he created a new market, so he changed the way companies looked at tablets. And in terms of iPhones, he changed the way Nokia and Sony made telephones. Okay? So, what that is what we're trying to get at here with market governance is you have incumbents and you have challengers. The incumbents have one dominant conception of control, okay? And when you get a challenger coming in, what the challenger does is challenge that conception of control. And that is a period of great uncertainty, okay? Which is exactly what companies don't like. So many companies don't like seeing challengers. They didn't like seeing Apple. Why? Because it put their own business model in jeopardy. They wanted to keep it nice and stable and keep the market governed. And then when Steve Jobs came along, suddenly that was no longer guaranteed. Okay? So most of the time what you see, Steve Jobs was successful with Apple at changing the conception of control, but most of the time what you end up finding is that a lot of firms will group together to make sure challengers go away. Okay? Or at least the challengers become a part of the incumbents. Okay? So where the challenge itself no longer exists, so they can get back to stability. Okay? And I just put down there at the bottom cap and trade incumbents. Cap and trade is an environmental plan in order to clean up the problems associated with climate change and global warming that's going on. It's shut down. It's no longer going to exist. But more or less what I like to point out with the conception of control, cap and trade was an environmental plan. It was designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay? Well, what ended up happening is in 2009, the Republicans in the House of Representatives killed the bill. Okay? Which in my opinion was actually pretty good. I didn't like cap and trade because out of the 400 companies that were trying to get permits, trying to get involved in cap and trade, about 320 of them were actually finance companies. Okay? They weren't environmental companies at all. They were banks, okay? Hedge funds. So the point being, do you think the conception of control in cap and trade, was it going to be oriented on fixing the environment of our country, or was it going to be interested in creating stock market bubbles and things like that? Okay? What banks do, at least these days. So, the point being, here you can see what I mean by a conception of control. Is the cap and trade market going to be environmentally oriented, or are they going to be focused on exchange rates and the prices of their assets and things like that? Completely different. They're antagonistic. That is what I'm getting at by conceptions of control and challengers versus incumbents. Okay? So now let's talk about pricing. The first thing it says in my lecture underneath pricing is empirically grounded. It's not deduced. Everything we've done with the neoclassicals, whether it be the shutdown point, the break-even point, etc., we've been using deduction. We say assume a standardized product, assume free entry and exit, assume many producers and sellers, or many sellers and buyers, and price take. Assume that. Well, once you assume that, it's not really hard to get to the shutdown point, the break-even point, things like that. As it turns out, those assumptions don't exist in the real world. In the real world, there aren't many sellers. In every industry, there's actually a few sellers. And they're not selling standardized products. They're selling heterogeneous products, okay? Things that are different. Nike shoes are different from Reebok shoes. Apple, an iPhone is not an Android phone. Trust me, Androids are better. And there are barriers to entry. There's no free entry and exit. Every industry has barriers to entry. Why? Because you don't want a challenger coming in and changing the conception of control. So what a lot of heterodox economists do is they go out into the world and they actually ask businesses, hey, how do you set your prices? Okay? And they do this for many businesses over decades. Okay? Fred Lee is an economist at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He's retired now, but he was. And he used to just basically interview literally thousands of businesses, asking them, how do you set your prices? How do you determine your level of output? And this is what he's found. Okay? And a lot of other heterodox microeconomists find the same thing. Okay? Once a firm has a long-term growth strategy, okay, once they know, okay, I want to grow 3% in the next 5 years, okay, what they do is they plan a normal level of output. Okay? They plan on a normal level of output. So Coca-Cola, we're going to move 5,000 units or 5 million units of Coca-Cola this business quarter. Okay? Meaning we're going to produce 5,000 cans of Coke between January and March. Right? Over the next 3 months, we're going to try to sell 5 million cans. So they produce 5 million cans. Android, right, or Samsung, we are going to produce 2 million phones over the next 1 year. Okay? You figure out a normal level of output, how much on average you're going to produce over some specified time interval. Okay? Then once you plan out what your normal level of output is, you usually break down your costs. Then you break down your costs on a per unit basis. Okay? Firms do one of two things. They either break their costs into average total costs or average direct costs. Okay? Direct costs simply meaning how much did it cost to produce this can of Coke? Okay? Or they figure out average total cost. How much on average did it cost to make this can? Now you may say to yourself, oh, we're back in the neoclassical world with average total costs. Remember, we're very, very far away from neoclassical microeconomics. I haven't done any marginal cost curves or things like that at all. That's not where the supply curve comes from. What I'm doing is simply saying firms decide how much they want to produce in some time interval, okay, some normal level of output. Once they come up with a normal level of output, then what they do is they just simply break down the costs. So, okay, it costs $9 million, or let's make this simple. It costs $3 million to make 3 million cans of Coke. Okay? So it costs $1 to make each can of Coke. That's our average total cost. Boom. Okay? Each unit costs $1, average total costs. It's actually quite simple. Then, once you figure out your average total cost or your average direct cost, whichever ones the firm decides to use. Okay? And firms, those are the two big ones you find. Okay? But remember, this isn't a universal theory. Firms do their costs many different ways. Okay? But once you get to your average total costs or your average direct costs, then what the company does is they mark up the costs by some percentage. Okay? So if it costs $1 to make the actual can of Coke, then you just simply mark up that cost based upon a targeted rate of return, your need for investment funds, or your profit level, the profit level you want to make. Okay? So if you want to make 5 cents profit, right? If you want to make a 5% profit, you have your dollar, which is what costs to make the can of Coke, $1, and then you simply just add 5 cents on, so now you're at $1.05, and that's your price. Okay? That's what's called a markup. It's the difference between the price and the costs, the average unit cost. That's a markup. Where does it come from? It's simply made up. The company marks up the costs in order to get the price based upon whether it wants, funds for investment. If they want to build a new factory, then what they do is, let's say, it costs $1 to make the can of Coke, and we need, 20 cents per can in order to get the investment funds we need. Okay, then the price will be $1.20. Most of the time, all three of these are used. Okay, it costs $1 to make a can of Coke. Let's say you need 15 cents in order to build a new factory. Okay, plus I want to make 10% profit. Okay, and I need to give my shareholders a 20% return, or let's say a 5% return, right? Shareholders need 5 cents. So that is $1 for the can, that's your cost, and then I need, what? I think I said 10 cents? 10 cents for my investment, for building a new factory. I need 10 cents for profit. I just want to make a profit of 10 cents per can, and then I have to give 5 cents to my shareholders. Okay, $1 plus 10 cents plus 10 cents plus 5 cents, that's $1.25. Can of Coke costs $1.25. Okay? That's how prices are actually set in the real world. It's through the markup. In the real world, what companies do is they figure out the normal level of output they're going to produce, they figure out the average cost per unit, and then they just mark up each unit in order to determine the price. Okay? What that allows us to see is that the supply curve is horizontal. Okay? This is the supply curve of neoclassical economics, right? Neoclassical economists say the supply curve is upward sloping. It's not true. In the real world, the supply curve is horizontal. Firms produce a normal level of output at a set price. Okay? Doesn't matter if it's 1 can of Coke at $1.25 or 1,000,000 cans of Coke. It's still going to cost, the price of each can will still be $1.25, right? You figure out how much you're going to produce, what you think you're going to sell. I'm going to make 3 million cans of Coke this month. How much did it cost to make each can? $3 million. So each can cost about $3 million. Or each can cost about $1 to make. I need 10 cents for investment. I need 10 cents for my profit, and I need 5 cents to give to my shareholders. So I'm going to mark up the can 25 cents. It costs $1 to make it, and then I'm going to add on 25 cents on top of that. The price will be $1.25. And that's where prices come from. It has nothing to do with the marginal cost curve and the average variable cost curve and the average fixed cost and all that stuff. No. Just think about if you were running a lemonade stand. How are you going to set your prices? You're going to figure out how much the lemonade costs you, and hey, I want to make some profit here. It's the same thing with Coca-Cola, IBM, Apple, all those companies. They simply mark up their costs to set a price. What that means is the first can costs $1, 25 cans costs $1, 30 cans costs $1. And you already know this. When you go to the soda machine, if you buy 1 can of Coke, it costs $1.25. If you buy 10 cans of Coke, each single one of them costs $1.25. So it doesn't matter how much quantity, the price is still the same. So we have a horizontal supply curve. Now let's see equilibrium. I mentioned at the beginning of our lecture, the demand curve for neoclassicals is okay. Okay? There's a couple issues, but more or less, it's okay to have a downward sloping demand curve. As price goes down, people buy more. Okay? So, you have a demand curve. This would be our equilibrium. Price is determined by the supply curve, so prices are determined by companies. But what determines the level of output? The level of output is determined by the level of demand. Right? If demand is here, that's our level of output. But if our demand curve shifts to the right, this will be our level of output. Okay? So it turns out demand is what determines the level of output. Okay? So just to summarize, what determines prices in heterodox microeconomics? Well, prices are determined by companies, right? Companies mark up their costs, and that's what determines price. What determines quantity? Quantity is determined by demand. The higher the level of demand, the higher the level of output. Okay? Now, I mentioned to you in week 2, you can think of demand as spending, right? So what this is saying is, the higher the level of spending, the higher the level of output. Okay? Which makes sense. If you think about it, the more a company sells, right? The only way for a company to make a sale is for someone to spend money. You have to walk in and purchase their product. Okay? So the more people who spend money, the higher the level of sales. The higher the level of sales, the more the company is going to say, hey, we're selling a lot of products, we should produce more. Okay? And in order to produce more, you need to hire more people to actually make it. So if you want to increase employment, you have to raise spending. You have to raise the level of sales. Okay? That means if you want employment to go up, if you want unemployment to go down, people need to spend more. This is exactly what John Maynard Keynes said in 1936. He wrote a book called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. And he said demand, he called it the principle of effective demand. He said demand is what drives an economy. Okay? He said prices are set by companies. But the level of output and employment, that is determined by the level of spending. Okay? It makes sense. The more people spend, the more companies make sales. The more companies make sales, the more workers they need to keep up with the level of sales. Okay? So, just in wrapping up, what determines prices? Firms decide what are my unit costs, right? How much does it cost to make, how much on average does it cost to make 1 unit of my product? Okay? Once you get that cost, say $1 for a can of Coke, which is far outrageously too expensive. It probably costs about half a cent to make a can of Coke. But if it costs $1 to make a can of Coke, then what we do is we simply mark up our costs to get a rate of profit. Okay? So you have, or if you need investment funds, or if you have to give money to your shareholders, things like that. But you mark up your costs. Okay? That gives you a price. And then you sell your output. So firms determine prices, and they have a horizontal supply curve. Whereas you have a demand curve that slopes downwards, okay? And the way you increase output, the way you get the economy to make more stuff, is you need to increase demand. Okay? So this is heterodox economics, this is supply and demand for heterodox economics. Neoclassicals have this, okay? Heterodox don't. Heterodox have a horizontal supply curve and regular demand curve, okay? What this also means is that there's no self-adjusting mechanism, okay? It's not like neoclassicals where, both supply and demand can shift until you reach an equilibrium. No. In heterodox economics, whatever the level of demand is what determines the level of output and employment, okay? There's no self-adjusting mechanism. If demand is low, then the economy won't make a lot of stuff. If demand is high, the economy will make a lot of stuff, okay? Simple as that, okay? It's really just common sense, and unfortunately, not a lot of people are exposed to this in their economics courses. I'm glad I was given the opportunity to expose you to it. I hope you enjoyed it. This is going to end our week 6 lecture, okay, which will conclude the course, okay? Thanks.